Welcome to the first section of classes, which is 1400s to 1950s Cuba. I'm your instructor, Jenny Desmond, the president of Viva Cuba, and you should know that this class module, usually takes about 50 minutes to do in class. So this will be a long recording. If you received the written version of the notes that along with the video, you might pull those out. It's a great place to take notes and to be able to follow along. So in 1492 was when Christopher Columbus claims he discovered Cuba. So the first time that he went to Cuba. And originally the island was called Juana. And after various names, the island was finally named Cuba, a variation of her indigenous name of Cubanascan. The indigenous groups that lived in Cuba, there were three different groups. And the first was the Guanahata Bayes, and they settled on the south and east or south coast on the west side of the island in the Isla of Juventud. And their main activities were dock fishing and collecting shellfish. They made tools from shells, and they were very primitive. In the central section of the island lived the Siboneyes, and they were more on the north coast of the island. They were more advanced than the previous group. They hunted and they fished. They built fires, they carved flintstones, and they lived in ravines and caves. And then the third population was the greatest population of indigenous people, and that was the Tainos. They were farmers. They primarily farmed yucca, from which they made cassava, a food that could be eaten immediately or could be preserved. They lived in various styles of houses made of wood, and here's a good example. The roof of these was made from a kind of palm tree called guano palm, and the Tainos spoke Arawak. So you often hear about Taino Indians living in Puerto Rico and other Caribbean islands, and it's the same group. And they originally came from the Amazon River Basin in South America. They can still be found in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, or remnants of their ancestors, and but not so much in Cuba. So what happened to the indigenous people? Throughout the Caribbean, the Spaniards removed men from villages to work in gold mines and colonial plantations. And primarily in Cuba, what happened was these Taino Indians, their families began to starve because they no longer had the men and strong boys to do the farming, to grow the yucca. Of course, the Spaniards brought with them illnesses such as smallpox, measles, and other European diseases. And many indigenous people committed suicide to avoid subjugation. And hundreds fell in fighting with the Spaniards. Now, you remember that these three indigenous groups lived on the largest island in the Caribbean, and there was no fight for space. They did not have experience in warfare between the indigenous groups. So they were quickly overtaken by the Spaniards. And then women were often taken as brides. So by 1514, barely 2 decades after the first Spaniards arrived in Cuba, 40% of Spanish men had taken indigenous women as their wives. There are documents from the 1530s in which the question came from Spain to the governor of Cuba. How many Indians are there? Who are the chiefs? The answer was none. They are gone. Now in 1514 began the rise of the Spanish Armada and pirates. So the Spanish silver fleet would start its collection in Venezuela and Peru, making stops in Panama and along the coast of Mexico. As the ships collected their cargo, they would head for the safe harbor of Havana, where they would form a massive flota before heading back to Spain. So Havana was a key location in preparing for them to make the long journey up to Spain. The islands of the Florida Keys, which are just 45 miles away from Havana, became the staging area for pirates who would lay in wait for the Silver Fleet as it approached Havana. They would mingle among the saloons and whorehouses in Havana, listening to idle gossip of any information for when the ships would be arriving. So as time passed, Havana and its harbor had to become well fortified in order to protect the Spanish ships loaded down with treasures. A fleet of Spanish galleons would also patrol the water looking for pirates. And soon they developed a large chain that was actually drawn over the mouth of the harbor into Havana to prevent saboteurs from entering the harbor and sinking the ships. And the reefs outside the harbor added to the protection, as well as it also added to the loss of many silver ships. So they developed this fortress called the Castillo del Morro, or nowadays in Havana we refer to it as El Morro. They began building this, and this is the favorite or famous fortress that you see anytime that you see pictures of Havana with the lighthouse. So they began building this fortress in 1563 as a mortar watchtower for the harbor. Late in 1602, the wall facing the sea was erected, and construction pretty much ended by 1630. El Morro has wells, barracks, dungeons, and a church. The structure of the fortress was built on a turret, or has a turret called El Morrillo, which is used as a watchtower. There are successive levels of defense, and the fort is an irregular polygon because they built it just conforming with the shape of the land. Traditionally, every evening at 9 o'clock was when they would fire a cannon blast to announce the opening to the bay was being closed by pulling up the chain. And so even today, they still do this cannon blast ceremony, and it's a fun thing to go do. They have soldiers marching in their 6th or 17th century uniforms and making announcements, and it's a fun thing to do. Plus, to get to see the fortress at night is pretty great too. If you've ever been to San Juan and to the fortress there in Viejo San Juan, this is very reminiscent, built in the same era, but this one is much bigger. So across from El Morro, or its full name is Castillo de los Tres Reyes Magos del Morro, is the Punta. And so it is the small fortress built on the other side of the bay. And so you can see that those fortresses are only 350 yards apart. So that's where the chain was pulled up. Just a few decades ago, they built a tunnel under the canal there called the Túnel de la Habana. And that is something that cars and buses are able to go through. So you can quickly make it from one side to the other. Whereas before the tunnel was built, it would take about 45 minutes to an hour to get around to the other side where El Morro Fortress is. So African slaves started arriving in Cuba as early as 1521. Slavery has an important heritage in Cuba. Originally, they were brought to work in the sugarcane and coffee plantations. And Cuba was 1521, Brazil was 1538, and the US, they didn't start arriving until 1619. And then it ended late in Cuba as well. So the slave trade ended in Brazil in the 1850s, in the US in the 1860s, but slavery itself was not abolished in Cuba until 1886. So it has the longest tradition of slavery in our hemisphere. You'll see in your notes that I printed out for you the names of the 4 major ethnic groups that were brought to Cuba, because they are African names. So the first was the Bantu. The second was the Yoruba, and the Yoruba had a key influence in Santeria religion, which we'll talk about later. The Igbo and the Iwi and others were brought, and they were primarily brought from Gambia, from Nigeria, Angola, and Mozambique. So the 7 Years' War was 1756 to 1763, and it had a huge impact on Havana. So the British were able to take over and occupy Havana from 1762 to 63, and they brought in more slaves during that 1 year than the previous years combined. So more than 700 slave ships or 10,000 slaves were brought in during that era. That was primarily people from the Yoruba tribes in Africa, and with them came the rich Afro-Cuban music, became Afro-Cuban music. African philosophy and religious traditions are often traced back to this period. But then in July 6th of 1763, the Treaty of Paris gave Spain the island of Cuba. So it went back to Spanish control. And can you guess what Great Britain got in return? They got the peninsula of Florida. That was the trade. Sugar boom and slavery. So Haiti and Cuba were rivals for the sugar capitals of the world. But there were many slave uprisings in Haiti between 1791 and 1803. And because of that, by the end of 1803, Cuba really replaced Haiti as the top supplier of sugar to Europe. And that's also the era when in around 1800 that many of the French plantation owners in Haiti fled and went to Cuba. So that's the time when Cienfuegos was established. So the sugar industry was very important in Cuba. And in 1830, there were over 1,000 mills producing 94 tons of sugar a year. And then in 1837, the first steam locomotive comes to Cuba that really helps to increase the production of sugar. Cuba was the 7th country in the world to have railways and the very first one in all of Latin America. So that's 1837. So Trinidad. Trinidad is one of, well, it's actually my very favorite city to visit in Cuba. And it is the home of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, both Trinidad and the valley that it's in, called Valle de los Ingenios. And Valle de los Ingenios really shows, it has a living museum featuring 75 former sugar mills, plantation houses, barracks, and other facilities related to this vulnerable industry.